Hello everyone and welcome back to IHE Indian Hospitality Expo 2020. Keeping all safety regulations in mind, this year we have completely gone virtual. However, the enthusiasm still is as much. So today we'll be doing, in the entire sessions of Beverage Masterclasses, today we'll be talking majorly about the spirits. And when you're talking about spirits, how can you forget or how can you not talk about whiskey? Just to give you a fact, India is the biggest whiskey consuming country in the world. Yes, as you heard it right, we do drink a lot of whiskeys. Another interesting fact is that when it comes to the global numbers, if you actually search the top 10 whiskey selling brands, not necessarily the best brands, but the most selling brands when it comes to whiskey, out of the 10, almost 4 brands are from India. Interesting enough, right? And I'm sure you might have had one or two of those brands for sure in your life. Cool. So talking about whiskeys today, I am Ankur Chawla. I have been in the beverage trade for quite some time. Majority of it was in the hotels. And almost 3.5-4 years ago, I quit my job and I started my own consulting. And I love doing what I'm doing right now, which is tastings and trainings, right? So cool. So talking about whiskeys, today in the entire beverage masterclass of whiskey and other spirits, we'll be focusing a lot more on whiskey initially, and in the categories or in the agenda, we'll be talking about just the basic introduction of what is a whiskey and how it is made, in terms of the process. We'll also talk about the world of whiskeys because there are so many whiskeys coming from different parts of the world. There are whiskies coming, of course, from Scotland and Ireland, kind of old regions, but there are also whiskies coming from places like Italy, which we never thought of, so much so. And of course, by the end of it, we will be doing the best part of the training, or which is called tasting, and we'll be tasting a blended malt and a blended Scotch whiskey and an Indian single malt. And after that, I'll tell you a little bit about the cocktails which are made with whiskey. Yeah, so cool. Starting with whiskey. Whiskey word actually came back in the days, it is a Gaelic word. In Latin, it is also called as aqua vitae, which basically or essentially means water or water of life. Interesting enough, right? And a lot of times it does act like water of life. So back in the days is when whiskey as a word came, and uski is the Gaelic word, wherein in recent years and over the years or over the period of time, it was called as whiskey. Back in the days, there are different stories to it, but whiskey started in a place in Ireland itself. What is whiskey? Whiskey is nothing else, but it is made out of the grain mash, and it is fermented and distilled in order to create and is aged in order to create what it is today in beautiful looking bottles. Yeah, it can be aged in wooden cask. It can be aged, in different oaks. It can be also aged in used oak barrels, which kind of gives another level or another layer of flavors. And there could be a mix of, 2 or 3 different oak barrels over the period of time when it comes to aging and creating a whiskey. The grain mash, which is the base of the whiskey, is can be made from different grains or different malts for that matter. It could be barley, it could be, which is the most sort of used as a base for the whiskey globally. It could be corn, it could be rye, which also adds a little bit of spiciness to the whiskey, or it could be wheat, or it could be something else as well. But these are the majority of the whiskeys are made with one of these, or a mix or a blend of all of these as the base. Normally, they are, as I said, aged in charred oak barrels. Charring would mean they are burnt from inside to give you that oakiness or the woodiness that you really get in the whiskey. Back in the days, I think the first time the whiskey used or the term was used was in Scotland as well in 1494, which is quite some time back, right? And whiskey, as a lot of other spirits, was initially made for the medicinal purposes. Obviously, that medicine is something that we all like now and we really, really enjoy. With regards to the Indian context, one of the first distilleries which were made in India was actually in Kasoli in the year 1820 by obviously, at that point in time, by Edward Dyer, during the British era for that matter. However, that was shifted from there to Solon purely because of one reason, because there was an abundant free flow of natural spring water. Natural spring water matters the most when it comes to any spirit, because that is getting used in the spirit as well. And coincidentally, we also having natural spring water from Solent today, so we would love to enjoy both of them together. Let's talk about the whiskey making process in eternity. Yeah. So what happens is, first and foremost, we get the grains, or we get those base grains or malts or rye or corn from the fields right in the distillery, so that we can use them to make the thing. Then we do mashing, wherein we mash it. We'll talk about it in detail. Then comes the fermentation as a process, and then comes distillation. After that, it goes for aging, and finally bottling, and then consuming. Right? Consuming is also a very important part. Talking, purely about malting or germination, as we say, when these grains come into the distillery, they're actually, huge and long distilleries and huge areas wherein this malted, either a barley or whatever is spread through in a big space, in a big room, after taking it or soaking in water. What happens with that is that the germination of these small little grains starts happening. That is where the starch gets activated, and that is where the germination happens. We also call this entire process as malting, wherein they will spread it completely from one place to the other, so that there is enough space and area to sort of germinate. And that's where this moisture comes right in the middle of the grain as well. After that, it goes for mashing. Now, in the mashing, the entire grains are gone, and there is mash, which is sort of converted into a sort of pasty, sort of thing, which is what becomes the base for making the alcohol or creating or taking out the liquid. Once the liquid is taken out, the liquid goes in the fermentation barrels, exactly like in a wine or in any other kind of alcohol. It goes straight for fermentation, and the sour mash, as they say, or the mash which is remained, can be used for cattle feed and other purposes as well. Most of these places also dry the mash, and they further sell it because it is really good protein content for a lot of animal feeding, and it could also be used in different fields for that matter. However, coming back to the liquid, which is our focus, the liquid goes for fermentation. Now, the fermentation can happen, as I said, for 4 to 5 days to even 15-20 days in controlled temperatures and controlled fermenting barrels. After the fermentation, the liquid that we get is essentially a beer, or wort, as they say, W-O-R-T. Now that is pretty much the beer that is ready, and that is really good enough and potent enough to be used in the base of whiskey. Now, what happens after that is a different process, which sort of differentiates a basic fermented beverage like a wine to a spirit, which is a distilled beverage as well. The distillation can happen through two different processes. One could be, one is a very age-old sort of process, which is known as pot stills, wherein there are pots and there are, stills made out of, it could be copper, it could be different materials as well, and the fire is right, under this one particular pot. Since there are two different temperatures at which alcohol evaporates, that's how the heads, the hearts and the tails evaporate, and they again condense in the other pot, and that is where the real alcohol, or the neutral alcohol, or ENA as we call it, is something that comes in. At this point of time, this liquid is completely transparent, very unlike the whiskey that you see, and very much similar to a vodka or a gin that you see over here. Now, this particular liquid is got the heads, the hearts and the tails. Heads is something which is the first batch, hearts is something which is the second batch, and the tails is the last bit of it. Normally, in a whiskey or in a good quality distillery, they would remove the heads and the tails, purely because they contain a lot of oils and a lot of bitterness as well. And it's the hearts that is getting used for your bottle of whiskey. So normally that particular liquid comes out as distilled, and that is used further. Now, this is a very age-old tradition, and some of the best whiskey distilleries are using still exactly the same process to get their whiskey out, or to get the ethyl or the neutral alcohol out. However, there's another way of, or the modern way of doing it as well. In the modern way, we call it either a patent still or a continuous still, in which there is this entire huge, two apparatus from where the whiskey goes, and the other side the cold water goes or the hot water goes, and one side is the evaporation and the other side is the condensation. The process is pretty similar. However, it can go continuously, and it is more towards machine that's doing the process, and over here it's more about the flavors and the length of the pot, and a lot of art or a lot of stories that actually come in. Few countries, depending on the regulations, have this regulation that it has to be sort of going through a pot still only. However, most of these new world or most of these big distilleries in the world are using continuous still, because once you press the button, the magic happens automatically. So that is distillation for you. After distillation, once we have got this neutral spirit or this transparent just clean looking liquid, which is the base of the whiskey, the magic starts in the distillery. Either you can have charred oak barrels, old used sherry barrels or wine barrels, that can give another dimension, or new French oak, depending on the style of whiskey that you would want to do. You use this particular liquid that goes straight in the barrel, and the aging starts. Now, during the aging, there are a lot of elements that actually play. Either it is new French oak, or it is new oak, which is sort of really strong when it is about giving flavors and the aromas for that matter. Or it could be old oak barrels as well, or it could be a mix and match of both. Depending on, again, country and region to region, there are different rules and regulations on which this particular entire technique would matter. And of course, it matters a lot on the master distiller as well, who's the one who kind of decides what is the final product that's coming out. However, when it comes to traditions and standardization of the whiskies which are very popular in the world, you would want a certain amount of consistency or certain amount of standardization, so the processes are as old as 50 to 100 to 200 years as well. Yeah. Another interesting thing that happens, which sort of defines or differentiates an Indian or a New World whiskey to a very old style of whiskey, is the aging, wherein so what happens is, it's basically alcohol which is in the barrel. Over the period of time, on an average, let's say every year, there is a certain amount of alcohol that gets evaporated in the air. In the most fancy way, or in the nice way rather, or in a way wherein the smile comes on the face, we always call it as angel share. We say, or the winemakers or the whiskey makers rather, or the distillers say that it is angel share. It is the angels from the clouds that came down and took their own share of whiskey. Now, angel share, it matters a lot when it comes to the aging. Why I'm saying that is because in cold countries like Scotland, Ireland, and other places, the angel share is about 1.5 to 2%, to the max. So, for instance, if I put 100 liters in a barrel to age, normally in a colder country you would get let's say 1.5 to 2 liters of whiskey being disappeared every single year. So when you talk about a whiskey which is, let's say, 12 years old or 18 years old, imagine the kind of liquid that has already gone in, and that is what brings the concentration, or that is what brings the real bold flavors in the liquid. The same thing happens in other parts of the world in a much more rapid way. So for instance, let's say a distillery which is, let's say, a Paul John in Goa, the evaporation or the angel share is anywhere between 7 to 8 to even 10%, which is very, very huge. So think about it, 10 years down the line you might not have enough whiskey in the barrel to even bottle. However, does that affect the flavors? Not really. It is very different, but it definitely gives enough amount of flavors to this whiskey as well, purely because the rapid evaporation is happening, or the rapid angel share is happening because of the humidity. But because of all of that, the aging is also getting faster. The flavors are also getting made really, really quick. So the magic, though, is very different in two different countries, but it is still enough and more to be offered in these beautiful bottles. And then finally, it is about bottling. Once you get these liquids out, which is aged anywhere between 2 to 3 to 4 years to even 30, 40, 50 years for that matter. Normally we hear about some really exciting whiskey auctions happening around the globe. wherein the whiskey is 50 years old, 30 years old, and so on and so forth. Normally, when you see in any bottle of whiskey, it could be from Scotland or wherever, if it says that it is aged for 12 years, that doesn't really mean that the whiskey completely is at least 12 years old. That basically means that the blend that has gone in the whiskey, if there are different blends, different whiskeys that have gone in there, the youngest blend or the youngest liquid is at least 12 years old. But the blend could be used from whiskeys which were made 30, 40, 50 years ago as well, or what they call it as a reserve. However, that doesn't really happen in the case of single malts. Why is that so? We'll just come to that. Yeah. So once you have that blend ready, once you have that entire process ready, depending on the style of whiskey that you have, you actually go ahead and you do the bottling of the whiskey and labeling. And most important step, to savor it as well. Now, what are the different kinds of whiskey? There are different stores around the globe. When you go inside a good boutique liquor shop, you see I don't know, 50, 100, and if you go internationally, some of the really big stores, you can even see a variety of 50, 100 to even 500 sort of different whiskey brands. Or you go to a good whiskey bar, you will see an entire array or entire range. Now, how are they different? Are they really very different than each other? What are the styles? So that is what we will talk about in this section. Firstly and foremostly, one of the most important, one of the most unique styles of whiskey, or one of the basic styles of whiskey, is known as malt whiskey. Now, malt is a whiskey which is primarily made out of malted barley. Normally there is a single malt, there is a grain malt, then a different kind of malt, but malt is sort of the big daddy of whiskeys for that matter. A grain whiskey could be made out of different kind of grains, which could be a mix of different grains, or it could be a single grain as well. Though a single malt, when we talk about the single malt whiskey, we're not saying that it is one single malt. Basically, the word single signifies that it is coming from a single distillery, so that it is not a mix and match of different distilleries, and it is particularly one malted grain which is being used in that particular whiskey. Yeah. And blended malt, or blended whiskey or blended Scotch whiskey, are basically the blends of two different malts, more than two different malts. It could be a blend of an age-old blend that you have in your reserve, which is sort of added like spices to the new blend, and to make it either to the levels that you want to showcase, or it could be, as I said, for the standardization process as well, because there is a decent amount of expectation that you have when you order or when you buy a bottle of X on this year, and the same X that you're buying, let's say 2 years, 3 years down the line. You don't want too much of the standardizations to change. And it also defines the price points of an X whiskey versus a Y whiskey, and why are they too expensive, or why is one expensive than the other. Cool. Then there are different styles of whiskey that are coming from the world. Of course, the most interesting or the most common known whiskies are coming from Scotland, but there are whiskies coming from US, which is again a huge production country in terms of whiskies, and again the most popular ones are of course the bourbon whiskies from there. American whiskey, I really feel that when it comes to American whiskey, I think the laws and the rules are really strict. Not primarily with regards to the production, but in terms of the labeling as well. Now, once you pick up a bottle of an American whiskey, and if you read it, you can get all the details on the whiskey as well. So, for example, one of the most popular ones is known as Bourbon, which usually comes from Kentucky, or that side of area from the USA. In terms of Bourbon, the basic criteria for a bourbon has to be that it has to use at least 51% of corn. Yes, it is made out of corn. Now, it could be more than that as well, but the basic eligibility criteria for a whiskey to be called as bourbon, it has to have at least 51% of corn, and it has to be aged in new oak charred barrels. Yeah. From that, there could be another whiskey as well from US that is coming out, which is called as corn whiskey. Now, as they say, when you call it corn whiskey, and if not a bourbon itself, the corn whiskey is supposed to have at least 80% of corn being used as the base for creating that whiskey. Again, it has to be in uncharted, or it could be in the used barrels as well. Malt whiskey is another one which is again very interesting, coming out from from different parts of the world. It has to be 51% plus malted barley of different this thing. Then of course, if you call it, in order to call any whiskey as rye whiskey, you have to have at least 51% of rye coming out from from America. Canadian whiskies are also getting very, very popular these days, and I think of lately I had tried a Canadian whiskey, and I think that's very, very interesting in its own space. It could be made out of cereal grains. Fermented mash is basically that has been used as the base, and it has to be aged at least for 3 years to be called it as a Canadian whiskey. Now, different parts of the world, different rules and regulations apply. Somewhere it is 2 years, somewhere it is 3 years, and somewhere there is no age statement as well, which we'll come down to in some time. Irish whiskey, one of the most important regions of whiskeys, because that is where it all started. When it comes to basic quality of whiskeys. Normally Irish whiskeys are distilled 3 times, but there are a lot of these distilleries who are trying to improve and upgrade themselves, and they're distilling it even more than 3 times for that matter. Normally in Irish whiskey you will see huge pot stills. Remember, we talked about distillation as a process which could be done either through pot stills or patent stills. Irish whiskies are the ones who are very kind of touched with regards to their own tradition, so they would most likely use post pot still, but of course there could be column stills as well that are getting used. But again, they are aged in the oak barrels for at least or no less than 3 years to be called as whiskies. Now let's come to the Scotch whiskies. That is where I think most of us sort of understood or learned about some interesting stuff. So Scottish whiskies are distilled at least twice, if not more, but there are a lot of these distilleries who are distilling it even more times for that matter. Minimum aging has to be again for at least 3 years. So for example, if you pick up a bottle of any Scottish whiskey, it could be a blended or a malt or whatever, and if it doesn't say anything on the label in terms of its aging, you can be rest assured that it is at least 3 years aged for that matter. Yeah. And normally, if it is about an age statement that is there, as I mentioned, it would definitely be mentioned on the label, which basically means, for example, if it says 12 years, it basically means that the blend of different whiskies or different malts that has gone in this particular bottle, the youngest one is 12 years old. The oldest one could be 30, 40, 50 years old as well, which again, depending on the distiller or the whiskey maker, how he wants to present or what is the kind of standardization that he wants to use. Another interesting thing, or another interesting stuff that is happening in the globally for that matter, or a revolution so to speak in a way, is something known as no age statement. Which is also, in a fancy way, they call it NAS whiskies, N-A-S, NAS whiskies, which basically means that, those are those expressions of liquids that a distiller or a whiskey maker or the producer or the distiller wants to show as those limited edition bottles. Some of the biggest brands have actually come out with these limited editions, and they call as NAS whiskies, that they don't want to, abide the whiskey by the statement of the age, or they don't want, these are these limited edition whiskies that you can't, easily try on different shelves as well. It could be, big brands like Chivas, it could be big brands of single malts, or it could be some Indian brands like Paul John, wherein the whiskey aging is not written at all, and it is more about the expression of the label. Normally in Scotland, though we talk about American whiskies, Irish whiskies, Indian whiskies, Japanese whiskies, but in Scotland you go a step below. You even go to the subheads of the particular regions as well. In the particular regions, you can have Highlands, wherein there is a particular style of whiskey, and majority of it is coming from Highlands and Lowlands. You could also go to Islay. Islay is one of these south islands from where the whiskies come. Most of these smoky or these big bold whiskies that are coming are actually coming from Islay style of whiskies. So much so, this has become a category by itself. If you find a smoky whiskey coming from whichever part of the world, there are a lot of times we would say it is more towards an Islay style of whiskey. So big brands like Lafroig, Ardbeg, the smoky and bold flavors of these whiskies are coming from Islay. Then of course you have Speyside and Campbelltown. Individually, we can go in the region, but again, we will not complicate it too much right now over here. But depending on which part of Scotland is your whiskey coming, I think you can get to know a lot more with that. Cool. Again, coming to the best part of the whiskey training, or any beverage training for that matter, is the tasting. Now, what we'll do is we'll taste. I think we'll taste a good single malt today. That's a Paul John single malt. They have a lot of different varieties. It is Nirvana. That is their expression that they say. It's about 40% alcohol. In India, normally you would see whiskey is not beyond 42.8, but there could be certain exceptions for sure. So, for example, this Black Label is about, which is again one of the most popular whiskeys around the globe. It is about 43% alcohol, and as it says, 12 years. The youngest blend is 12 years. Now, that's a single malt. That's a blended whiskey. Yeah. It says unpeated. Normally, the peat is added to the mash, for example, for basically getting a lot of smoky flavors. Now, it says it is unpeated, and they also, I believe, don't do any kind of charcoal filtration, which is where the cleaning of the whiskey happens, or the shiny or the beautiness of the whiskey comes. But a few distilleries believe that it loses out a lot of flavors and oils and essential elements to the whiskey as well. So let's try a single malt today. Normally, in terms of whiskeys, there are different styles of drinking whiskeys. It could be cocktails, it could be with water, it could be with soda, it could be with a lot of ice, as they call it, as they call on the rocks. But what we'll do over here is that the best way in terms of professional whiskey tasting, we always suggest that just have a little bit of whiskey and a little bit of water that gets added in order to accentuate the flavor. Now, try and understand, these all beautiful whiskey bottles have been bottled, or the whiskey has been in the bottle or has been aging for years and years. In order to open up, or in order to start a conversation with a good liquid, you need to do something to trickle it, and that is what we have done by adding responsible water. Cool. So we'll just smell the whiskey a little bit. Normally, I would not suggest you to directly smell or sniff it straight from the nose. Normally, when you're just starting the evening or starting a session, you can, sort of keep it a little far, purely because the sniff comes really strong, and, it gives you a whiff of a lot of flavors, which initially might not be very attractive, but eventually everybody falls for it. So yeah, it's quite a strong one, I believe, and it's getting the bold flavors. It's, I think, about aged for 4 to 5 years. However, remember, the aging time in India is very different than the aging time in Scotland, for that matter, or a cold country versus a warm country. Never judge a whiskey or any liquid by just the first sip, because your palate is not really trained for the first sip. Always have a second sip to really come out with the flavors. Whiskey is really, really bold. I think I'm getting a lot of, it is really, really very well balanced. It is giving me a lot of smoky notes, a lot of these bold flavors of leather, and a lot of cherries, for that matter. But it is also giving me some sweet spices right at the end, with a lot of astringency or acidity on the side as well. Seems to be a pretty good single malt coming from India, and I think it has been awarded a few times, or a lot of times rather, as well. When it comes to Black Label, I think I don't need to speak much about it, because you already know a lot about Black Label as it is. It is one of the most popular whiskies around the globe from the entire banner of Johnnie Walker, and it's doing pretty interesting stuff these days as well. Yeah. So that's about whiskey. Let's talk a little bit about cocktails. Some of the cocktails which are really popular when it comes to whiskeys, I think I personally love is a Manhattan. A Manhattan is an aged old, a classic whiskey cocktail. So is a whiskey smash or a whiskey sour. In a lot of times, whiskey sour, and there is a little bit of egg white that is getting used. Just a quick trick or a cheat sheet I might give you. A lot of people don't like egg. You could add a little bit of pineapple juice to get that froth out and still have that freshness. Mint julep is another beautiful whiskey which I call the cousin of mojito with regards to the whiskeys. Sazerac and Old Fashioned are the other ones as well. So that's how we enjoy a good bottle or a good dram, as they say in the most fancy words. So of course, when you're enjoying good quality of spirit like Paul John or a Black Label or any other good whiskey, normally it is said that it's only 20 or 30% of the drink which is good quality whiskey, but it is about 70 or 80% of the mixer that can change, make or break the drink. You got to be very, very careful in what are you using. Normally I would use some good quality water in the whiskey, and a lot of people would want to add some soda, which kind of accentuate the flavors, and it can get a lot of tingling effects that you can get. I would request you to open the bottle of soda usually on the side so that the pop doesn't really come up. But the sparkles in the soda and finally in the drink do add a lot when it comes to the flavor. A small experiment that you can do at your house is that you can either enjoy the whiskey by itself and add a little bit of soda, and it can definitely add a lot of energy to the drink, and I always say that it makes the drink much more interactive, and then that is when you start having good conversations with a good quality whiskey. Now, keeping that in mind and talking about other spirits and other beverages, something that we really found interesting was this bottle of Greater Than Gin. A dear friend is the one who's started this, and it has brought in a revolution by itself. It's a beautiful Greater Than gin. It is a London dry style of gin that is getting made in a very own country in India. It comes from Goa, and it definitely has done really well. It is small batch, and I think they're picking up juniper berries very carefully, and it definitely adds a lot of interesting elements as well. The other botanicals that they're adding is coriander seeds, lemongrass, chamomile, ginger, orange peel, and even fennel. I think that's the kind of blend that you would need in a good gin to really come out and stand out in the day. I can't wait but to taste this beautiful bottle of gin and make myself greater again. There you go. So normally in a gin, the basic thing that you would need is, of course, juniper berries, and I think that defines a lot, with the quality of gin that you want to produce. And then the other elements that kind of get added, and a beautiful balance is sort of created to really get a good quality gin out. You can firstly and foremostly you can get really a good whiff of juniper, and I think that sort of gives me an assurance that this is actually a good gin. It is so smooth. I just had it by itself. Normally you would add tonic water, soda or anything else. But I think just a couple of cubes of ice and I think it can do a great job. Whenever you're enjoying any kind of spirit from anywhere in the world or across the world, normally, as I say, it is only, it is 70% of the chaser or the beverage mixer which makes the most of the difference. Always try to remember, get good quality water right from the spring in the Solan in Himachal. This is India's first natural spring water which is coming in a can, so you could enjoy that as well. It is available in a few cities in India, but pan-India through online channels, and it is all natural spring. But the most important part, it is made out of 70% recycled aluminium in these cans. So I would always request you to be much more responsible towards the nature, towards the environment, and towards the coming generations as well. So let's get responsible with responsible water. Cheers, guys.